Yes, I've never done that in my life because I believe the Bible says the power of life and death are in the tongue. The hardest part of the body to control is not what we think, it's the tongue.
Right.
For God said, let there be light, and there was. So I have never planned that because I was afraid.
One argument changed the way people saw Dog Chapman and his son, Leland. What had looked like one of reality television's strongest father and son partnerships suddenly became a very public family conflict, and Leland eventually walked away from the business he had built alongside his father.
Well, that happened, I think, when I was about 12. Well, actually, I started bounty hunting with my father. I met him when I was about 5. He was in prison. He got out of prison. That's when I met him. And I would say probably by the time I was 7, 8 years old, I was knocking at doors dressed as a newspaper person. They would answer the door. I would ask for them, hand them just a piece of paper or whatever my dad gave me, step out of the way, and he would bust them.
But leaving the show was only part of the story. What really happened between Dog and Leland behind the scenes? And why did their relationship become so complicated? Join us as we uncover what pushed Leland away, what happened between father and son afterward, and the truth about where Dog and Leland stand today. The father and son behind the cameras. When Dog the Bounty Hunter introduced viewers to Leland Chapman, the relationship between him and his father already had years of history behind it. Leland wasn't simply another member of Dog's bounty hunting team. He was a son trying to build a relationship with a father he had not always been close to. In fact, the show's second episode, Father and Son, specifically focused on how difficult it had been for Dog and Leland to get to know each other again after Dog's imprisonment and Leland's troubled teenage years. That background changed the way their partnership looked. To the audience, Dog was the experienced bounty hunter teaching his son the family trade. Behind that image was something more personal, as Leland was also learning how to work alongside a father he had spent years trying to understand. The two weren't starting from a perfectly settled relationship when the cameras arrived. They were rebuilding something while simultaneously turning it into a business partnership. And Leland quickly became more than just Dog's son on the payroll. The early episodes showed him handling cases with other members of the team, and A&E's own description of father and son has Dog traveling from Honolulu to Kona to help Leland with fugitives before the two spend time together at Leland's boxing gym. The show was therefore presenting two stories at once: a bounty hunter training the next generation and a father trying to reconnect with his son. That distinction mattered because Leland was developing an identity of his own. He was involved in bounty hunting, had his own interests outside the family business, and was gradually becoming more confident in the profession. In the show's third episode, The Competition, Dog and Beth were even placed against Leland and Justin in separate hunts, turning the younger members of the team into direct competitors. It was entertaining television, but it also showed that Leland was no longer simply following his father's footsteps. He was becoming capable of standing on his own. Still, working for your father creates a pressure that ordinary employees don't have. A disagreement over a case can become a family argument. A business decision can get personal. And when the family business is also being filmed for television, there is another layer. Private problems can suddenly become public entertainment. That tension was already sitting underneath the successful image viewers saw. Dog was the established star, while Leland was the son trying to establish himself within the same world. Their closeness was real, but so was the imbalance between them. Eventually, the question wasn't simply whether Leland could work for his father. It was whether he could continue doing so without losing his own place in the family and the business. And when that pressure finally boiled over, the father-son partnership viewers had grown used to seeing began to fall apart when the family business finally broke apart. The tension became impossible to ignore during the final stretch of Dog the Bounty Hunter. Leland and his older brother, Dwayne Lee, were no longer simply working alongside their father and stepmother. Disagreements about their roles and the direction of the business had become serious enough to affect the entire team. By 2011, both brothers had stopped working with Dog and Beth, although exactly how that happened became a matter of dispute. Some reports described the brothers as having been fired, while the family maintained that they had quit. The moment eventually shown on television was especially uncomfortable because it wasn't some carefully edited explanation after the fact. It was an argument happening in front of the cameras. Dwayne Lee confronted Beth and told her that if she wanted him gone, she would have to fire him. Leland then announced that he was quitting too. The exchange made it clear that the problem had gone beyond an ordinary disagreement at work. Family relationships and business responsibilities had become impossible to separate. For Leland, there was another complication. He wasn't simply walking away from a television job, he was stepping away from the family operation that had helped shape his career. He had already established himself as a bounty hunter and bail bondsman, and leaving meant creating a professional identity that wasn't completely dependent on his father's name. That decision could have permanently changed the relationship between them. But the public explanation never settled everything. Reports around the time offered different accounts of whether Leland and Dwayne Lee had voluntarily left or had effectively been pushed out. Even Beth's comments suggested that the family was dealing with a larger question about the adult children eventually needing to establish their own paths. In other words, what looked like one explosive argument had been building from deeper disagreements about independence, responsibility, and working together as a family. Then something happened that made the situation even more complicated. Leaving Dog the Bounty Hunter did not permanently end Leland's connection to his father. In 2013, Leland returned to television alongside Dog and Beth for Dog and Beth: On the Hunt. The show's premise itself acknowledged the changed family dynamic, with Dog and Beth traveling around the country while working with bail bond agencies and, importantly, reuniting with Leland. That return is significant because it challenges the idea that Leland simply walked away from his father and never looked back. Whatever happened during the earlier fallout, there was still enough of a relationship left for them to work together again. The cameras had captured their worst disagreement, but they would eventually capture something else. A father and son trying to find a way forward without pretending the conflict had never happened. So if Leland really wanted nothing more to do with Dog, why did he come back to work beside him again? The reunion that changed everything. Leland's return to the family business showed that the earlier fallout had not permanently destroyed his relationship with Dog. When Dog and Beth on the Hunt premiered in 2013, the family was back on television, but the dynamic had changed. Leland was no longer simply the son working under his father's operation. He had begun building a separate professional life, including his own bail bond business, while still appearing alongside Dog when their paths crossed. That independence became increasingly important. Leland eventually operated Kama'aina Bail Bonds in Hawaii, establishing a career that could stand apart from his father's television empire. The decision didn't necessarily mean he had rejected Dog. If anything, it suggested that the earlier conflict had forced him to figure out what his relationship with his father looked like when they weren't constantly working under the same roof. Their relationship also had a deeper history than the arguments viewers saw on television. In a later conversation between the two, they spoke about the experience of being arrested together in Mexico after their 2003 capture of fugitive Andrew Luster. Leland recalled sitting with his father while facing the possibility of a lengthy prison sentence, an experience that had clearly stayed with him. Whatever disagreements came later, They had already gone through an extraordinary amount together. That shared history makes their relationship difficult to reduce to a simple feud. Dog was not just Leland's employer, and Leland wasn't just another employee who eventually quit. They had survived dangerous situations together, built a television career together, and experienced some of their family's most difficult moments in front of an audience. So when they disagreed, the emotional stakes were naturally much higher. There was also a practical reality that television could not completely hide. Dog's career had become a family enterprise, but his children were adults with their own ambitions. Leland had to decide how much of his professional identity would remain tied to his father's name. Leaving one business and eventually returning to work alongside Dog showed that the answer wasn't simply choosing one side. Their relationship could continue even when their careers moved in different directions. And that distinction became especially important after Beth's death in 2019. Leland was among the family members who continued to appear around Dog during a period when the Chapman family was dealing with an enormous personal loss. His own life had also moved forward professionally and personally, but the family connection remained. Dog later continued appearing publicly with members of his family, while Leland maintained his own work in Hawaii. Looking at everything that happened, the story becomes less about one dramatic argument and more about a son eventually separating his career from his father's while trying to preserve the relationship underneath it. The cameras captured the confrontation, but they didn't capture every conversation that followed. So after everything they had been through, did Dog and Leland actually repair their relationship? Or was there still a deeper distance between them? When Beth's death changed their relationship, the relationship between Dog and Leland entered a very different phase after Beth Chapman passed away in June 2019. Whatever disagreements had existed between father and son were now being overshadowed by something much heavier: the loss of the person who had been at the center of their family and television life for years. Dog openly struggled with the aftermath, later describing how difficult the period became once the attention surrounding Beth's death had faded, and he was left dealing with the loss privately. For Leland, Beth's death was also personal. She had been his stepmother, business partner, and a major part of the family dynamic that audiences had watched unfold on television. Their relationship had not always been simple, particularly around the period when Leland left Dog the bounty hunter, but grief had a way of putting old disagreements into perspective. The family was no longer dealing with television schedules or business disagreements. They were trying to adjust to life without someone who had held the family together. Leland later spoke about Beth's passing in a 2025 podcast interview, discussing both the loss itself and what life had been like after leaving the television spotlight. The conversation offered a glimpse of how much the Chapman family's public image had changed. The audience had once watched them work together almost every week, but by then, Leland had built a life largely outside the reality TV world. That separation mattered because Leland was no longer defined entirely by his father's career. He had his own family, his own business, and his own identity away from the cameras. In fact, recent profiles note that he eventually operated Kama'aina bail bonds in Hawaii after leaving his father's operation. The decision allowed him to continue working in an industry he knew well without having every professional move tied directly to Dog. But independence did not mean the relationship disappeared. Their shared history was simply too complicated for that. Dog and Leland had worked together, faced legal trouble together, and built part of their careers in front of an audience. They had also experienced losses that most families would struggle to process privately, while theirs unfolded under public attention. That may be the part of their story that gets lost when everything is described as a feud. Leland leaving his father's business was real, and there were genuine disagreements surrounding the family's professional life. But leaving was not the same as permanently cutting ties. As the years passed, both men continued moving forward with their own lives, while remaining connected as father and son. And that makes the question surrounding Dog's latest revelations much more complicated than simply asking who was right or wrong. If Leland really did walk away from Dog's world to build one of his own, what finally brought the two men to a place where they could look back at everything that happened? What Dog and Leland finally admitted about each other? The most revealing update didn't come from another reality show. It came when Dog and Leland sat down together in front of a live audience for their first joint podcast appearance in April 2026. The conversation covered fugitive recovery, their careers, and some of the experiences that shaped them, but one part stood out. When they were asked what happens when the two of them disagree, Dog made it clear that the explosive arguments people remember are no longer part of their relationship. He said they haven't had those kinds of arguments in a long time. That admission matters because it changes the way the old conflict should be understood. The public saw the moments when the relationship was under pressure, but those moments were not necessarily the final chapter. Dog and Leland had eventually reached a point where they could disagree without turning every difference into another family crisis. That doesn't erase what happened between them. It simply shows that the relationship continued developing after the cameras stopped following every move. The same conversation also revealed something about how Leland now views his father. When the hosts brought up their infamous arrest in Mexico after they captured fugitive Andrew Luster, Leland remembered being together in jail and facing the possibility of decades behind bars. He recalled what Dog told him during that frightening period, showing that despite everything that later happened between them, some of his strongest memories of his father were connected to moments when the two of them had no choice but to rely on each other. That story gives their relationship a different dimension. Leland wasn't simply the son who left his father's television operation. He was also someone who had experienced extreme situations alongside Dog, learned the bounty hunting business from him, and eventually built his own career from that foundation. In a 2025 interview, Leland discussed his life after television and reflected on his relationship with his father, suggesting that stepping away from the spotlight had given him room to look at his past differently. And perhaps the biggest revelation is that there doesn't appear to be one secret incident that explains everything. The documented story is much more human. A complicated father-son relationship became a working partnership. The partnership eventually fractured, and Leland went on to establish a life of his own. Yet the two continued finding their way back to each other at different points, even when they were no longer building the same career. Today, Dog and Leland can sit beside each other publicly and talk about the past without pretending none of it happened. They can laugh about old disagreements, discuss the dangerous experiences they shared, and still work in the same profession while maintaining separate lives. That doesn't mean every issue between them magically disappeared. It means they found a way to stop allowing old conflicts to define the entire relationship. So, what really happened with Leland Chapman? The answer isn't a secret betrayal or one dramatic family breakup. It was a father and son who struggled to separate family from business, eventually went their separate professional ways, and slowly found a healthier distance from which to remain connected. And after everything Dog and Leland have survived together, could their relationship today actually be stronger? Because they finally learned how to be father and son without having to be business partners? The truth behind their relationship today. What makes Dog and Leland's story difficult to pin down is that their relationship never really fit the simple narrative of a father and son who had a major falling out and then completely walked away from each other. Their professional lives separated, but the family connection remained. Leland continued working in the bail bond industry independently, while Dog gradually moved away from the television format that had made the family famous. The clearest evidence that the relationship was not permanently broken came through their continued appearances together. Leland returned to work alongside his father on Dog's Most Wanted in 2019, including a storyline where Dog helped Leland's team pursue fugitives. That was significant because it showed the two men could still work together despite everything that had happened earlier. Their relationship had changed, but it had not disappeared. There is also an important difference between what happened on television and what happened privately. Reality television naturally focused on conflict because disagreements made compelling viewing. But Leland's decision to leave his father's operation was ultimately part of a larger process of building an independent career. By 2024, he was operating Kama'aina bail bonds in Hawaii, separate from Dog's business. That independence appears to have become one of the defining features of Leland's adult life. He wasn't simply trying to remain Dog's son on television. He was establishing himself as a bail bondsman and bounty hunter in his own right, while also maintaining his own family life. The distance allowed father and son to exist without every disagreement, becoming a question about whether their entire relationship had fallen apart. And then came another major shift. In April 2026, Dog and Leland reportedly sat down together for a podcast conversation hosted by Off the Hook Bail Bonds. The appearance was notable because it brought the two men together in a setting where they could talk rather than simply perform their roles from the old television shows. The more complicated truth is that their relationship went through professional disagreements, separation, and years of change, while the underlying family bond continued. In the end, neither man needed to completely erase the other to move forward. Did Leland Chapman's decision to step away from Dog's business actually save their relationship? Or did it simply give father and son the distance they needed to finally understand each other? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.